It began with a sealed meeting inside Windsor Castle, one attended not by ministers or diplomats, but by executors, private solicitors, and the last surviving custodians of Queen Elizabeth's personal directives. When Catherine emerged nearly 40 minutes later, even senior aides noticed the shift. Calm, composed, but visibly burdened, because what had just been revealed was not merely a family matter. It was a decision capable of reshaping the balance of power inside the monarchy forever. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For years, whispers had drifted through the corridors of Buckingham Palace about a private collection so significant, so emotionally tied to the late Queen Elizabeth herself, that even senior royals rarely discussed it openly. It was not the crown jewels displayed for tourists behind reinforced glass. This was something entirely different. A hidden sanctuary of royal inheritance tied not to the state, but to bloodline, loyalty, and personal trust. Reports now suggest that during a confidential legal briefing attended by Catherine, Prince William, and royal executors, those private holdings were formally placed under Catherine's sole custodial authority. Not ownership, not possession. Custodial authority. And inside palace walls, that distinction carried enormous meaning. The atmosphere surrounding the transfer was said to be unlike anything aides had witnessed since the final months of Queen Elizabeth's reign. Staff members who had worked inside royal residences for decades reportedly described an unusual tightening of internal communication. Certain schedules were cleared without explanation. Security protocols shifted quietly behind the scenes. Even longtime household officials were allegedly informed only on a need-to-know basis. That secrecy alone ignited speculation. Why would a jewelry transfer require the kind of confidentiality usually reserved for constitutional matters or succession planning? And why had the documents reportedly been finalized before several senior members of the family were even informed? Those questions spread rapidly through royal circles because the vault itself had become something far larger than a collection of historic treasures. Insiders whisper that Queen Elizabeth viewed the private jewelry archive as an extension, ion of the monarchy's emotional memory. Every sapphire carried echoes of state visits and diplomatic triumphs. Every brooch represented moments of resilience during national crises. Some pieces were linked to Queen Mary. Others traced back to Queen Victoria. Several items reportedly held deep personal significance connected to Princess Diana, making their future stewardship emotionally explosive within the family. Different interpretations of the Queen's final intentions now paint a picture of a monarch quietly, preparing for instability long before the public realized how fragile the institution had become. What stunned commentators most was not simply Catherine's involvement, but the exclusivity of it. Reports suggest there were no shared custodians, no rotating oversight committee, no wider family administration. Catherine alone had reportedly been entrusted with protecting the collection's future. Palace insiders claim Prince William viewed the decision as a continuation of Queen Elizabeth's long-term vision for the monarchy, one centered on stability, restraint, and discipline rather than personal ambition. And according to sources familiar with royal administrative procedures, the future king allegedly supported the arrangement immediately, seeing it as both symbolic and necessary during a period of growing internal tension. Yet Catherine herself remained silent. Days passed without statements, appearances, or clarification. That silence only deepened the mystery. Some royal commentators interpreted it as caution. Others believed it reflected the sheer emotional weight of what had been handed to her. Because within the monarchy, silence has always carried its own language. And this silence felt deliberate, controlled, almost protective. Media outlets across Britain began describing the arrangement as a modern-day crown covenant, comparing it to the kind of quiet royal understandings that shaped entire generations behind closed palace doors. Suddenly, attention shifted away from the jewels themselves and toward the deeper question nobody could stop asking. What had Queen Elizabeth seen in Catherine that convinced her she alone could safeguard one of the monarchy's most sacred private legacies? The answer, according to various interpretations emerging from former palace staff and royal historians, may have been forming for years. Catherine had never applied. roached royal symbolism with extravagance or entitlement. She reportedly studied protocol obsessively, respected institutional traditions, and understood the emotional power attached to royal heirlooms in ways few outsiders ever fully grasped. Unlike others who allegedly viewed jewels as displays of prestige, Catherine was said to treat them as living artifacts tied to duty and continuity. And perhaps that was what mattered most to Elizabeth in the end. Not glamour, not popularity, but trust. Because as palace insiders now whisper with growing intensity, Queen Elizabeth's final concern was never whether the jewels would survive after her death. It was whether the values they represented would survive with them. And according to reports emerging from inside Windsor itself, that fear may have shaped one of the most consequential private decisions of her reign, a decision whose full impact is only beginning to unfold behind palace walls even now. But the real shock wasn't that Catherine had inherited responsibility over the vault. It was why Queen Elizabeth allegedly believed only one person could be trusted to protect it. For decades, the public believed the crown jewels were the monarchy's greatest treasure. But palace historians have long whispered about another collection far more personal, far more politically sensitive, and protected behind layers of royal silence. Hidden within private vaults tied to Windsor and Buckingham Palace sat generations of necklaces, tiaras, brooches, sapphires, emeralds, and handwritten inventory ledgers known only to a tiny inner circle. The distinction between the crown jewels and Queen Elizabeth's private jewelry collection was never fully understood outside palace walls, and according to royal historians, that confusion was intentional. The crown jewels belonged to the institution itself, held in trust for the nation and bound by constitutional protections that no monarch could privately control. But Elizabeth's personal collection existed in an entirely different realm. These were not ceremonial relics displayed for public spectacle. They were deeply personal symbols of inheritance, memory, diplomacy, heartbreak, and power. Passed carefully from monarch to monarch, generation after generation, the collection reportedly carried emotional significance far beyond financial value. And that was precisely why the question of who would one day safeguard it became so explosive after Elizabeth's passing. Insiders whisper that some of the vault's contents had not been seen publicly in decades. There were said to be sapphire pieces tied to Queen Victoria's private court, diamond brooches linked to Queen Mary's state dinners before the First World War, and rare emerald sets reportedly associated with diplomatic exchanges never fully documented in public archives. Then there were the pieces connected emotionally to Princess Diana, items that carried their own painful history inside the House of Windsor. Royal commentators quietly observed that certain jewels had almost become sacred objects within the family, protected not because of their price, but because of what they represented: legacy, continuity, survival through scandal, grief, and public scrutiny. That emotional weight reportedly created growing anxiety behind the scenes during the final years of Elizabeth's reign. According to palace administrative sources, senior aides and royal historians feared disputes could erupt over the collection once the Queen was gone. Unlike state property governed by rigid constitutional frameworks, personal royal heirlooms occupied a dangerous gray area where symbolism and authority often collided. And inside a monarchy already strained by internal fractures, the possibility of conflict surrounding Elizabeth's private legacy became something palace officials allegedly monitored with increasing concern. It was during this period, according to various interpretations from royal insiders, that Catherine quietly began drawing Elizabeth's attention in unexpected ways. Long before whispers about custodianship emerged, Catherine reportedly immersed herself in the traditions surrounding royal preservation. She was said to study not only protocol, but the emotional history attached to royal symbolism itself. Former staff members claim she approached heirlooms with remarkable restraint, never treating them as personal trophies or tools for publicity. Instead, she allegedly viewed them as institutional artifacts tied to something larger than any single individual. That distinction mattered deeply to Elizabeth. Sources close to former palace advisors now claim the late Queen admired Catherine's discipline, patience, and refusal to chase spectacle, while others inside royal life often became consumed by status. Fluence, or visibility. Catherine reportedly maintained a quieter approach that reminded Elizabeth of another young royal from decades earlier herself. Comparisons between Catherine and the younger Queen Elizabeth began surfacing more frequently among royal commentators after 2022, particularly regarding their composure under pressure and instinctive understanding of duty over personal emotion. Neither woman sought dominance through noise. Their influence emerged through steadiness, consistency, and control during periods of instability. And perhaps that was what ultimately separated Catherine from everyone else in Elizabeth's eyes. Because as palace tensions quietly intensified behind closed doors, the late Queen reportedly became less concerned with admiration and more concerned with protection. Protection of tradition, protection of continuity, protection of the institution itself during a time when loyalty inside royal life no longer felt guaranteed. The jewels, according to former staff whispers, had become symbolic of something far greater than inheritance. They represented the monarchy's surviving emotional core. And according to whispers from former palace staff, Elizabeth's final concern was never the jewels themselves, but who might try to control them after she was gone. Long before the executors delivered their verdict, tensions had reportedly been building behind palace walls. Different factions within the royal household had begun circling around questions nobody dared ask publicly. Who would ultimately oversee the late Queen's private legacy, and who would be shut out from it forever? What began as quiet administrative discussions soon evolved into a chilling internal power struggle. At first, the disagreements were subtle enough to escape public attention. Small procedural delays. Private consultations extended without explanation. Requests for ceremonial access quietly reviewed and then reviewed again. But according to insiders familiar with palace operations, those seemingly minor disruptions masked a much deeper conflict unfolding beneath the surface of the monarchy. Because once Queen Elizabeth was gone, the institution she had controlled with such discipline suddenly found itself navigating an uncertain future where sentiment, symbolism, and influence had become dangerously intertwined. And nowhere was that tension more intense than around the private jewelry collection she left behind. Reports suggest disagreements emerged almost immediately regarding how the collection should be handled moving forward. Some senior figures allegedly favored broader ceremonial integration, allowing more pieces to circulate publicly in order to modernize the monarchy's image and maintain public fascination. Others viewed that idea as deeply reckless. To traditionalists within the royal household, these heirlooms were never intended to function as publicity instruments or tools for reinvention. They were sacred fragments of dynastic continuity, carefully protected across generations through war, scandal, abdication crises, and public collapse. The fear, according to palace historians, was that once tradition began bending to popularity, the emotional authority surrounding the monarchy itself could begin eroding beyond repair. Whispers surrounding Queen Camilla's circle only intensified those anxieties. While no official disagreement was ever acknowledged publicly, insiders allegedly claimed that some supporters within Camilla's orbit favored a more flexible approach to the collection's future use. Various interpretations of internal meetings describe discussions about wider accessibility, evolving ceremonial presentation, and broader integration of certain historic pieces into future royal events. To critics inside the palace, however, those proposals represented something far more dangerous than modernization. They saw them as the first cracks in a system Elizabeth had spent 70 years protecting with relentless caution. That was where Princess Anne reportedly entered the picture with increasing force behind the scenes. Sources close to palace administrative staff claim Anne became one of the strongest defenders of preserving Elizabeth's original intentions exactly as they had been outlined privately during her final years. Prince William was allegedly aligned with her almost immediately. Together, they were said to share growing concerns that the monarchy's stability depended not on reinvention, but on disciplined continuity. And as those tensions quietly escalated, Catherine's role inside the institution began changing dramatically. By late 2023, according to royal commentators, Catherine was no longer viewed simply as the future queen beside William. She had reportedly become something much more significant. Cant within palace calculations. a stabilizing figure capable of preserving balance during an increasingly fragile transition period. Former aides claim her calm approach, emotional restraint, and instinctive respect for protocol distinguished her from nearly everyone else within the younger generation of royals. While public attention often focused on glamour or popularity, palace insiders allegedly paid attention to something entirely different: consistency under pressure. That consistency became even more important as reports emerged that private inventories tied to the collection were being reviewed repeatedly after Elizabeth's death. Access permissions were allegedly tightened. Archival records were cross-checked with unusual frequency. Certain ceremonial approvals reportedly required direct senior authorization instead of routine clearance. None of it was acknowledged publicly, but according to sources familiar with internal operations, the atmosphere inside royal residences became increasingly tense. One royal commentator later described it as icy but controlled, a phrase that quickly spread among observers attempting to understand why ordinary administrative procedures suddenly felt politically explosive. And perhaps the most unsettling part was how carefully everyone involved seemed to measure their movements. Nobody appeared willing to trigger open confrontation. Not while King Charles remained under growing pressure. Not while the monarchy itself was navigating uncertainty on multiple fronts. Instead, the struggle unfolded through silence, protocol, and quiet positioning behind closed doors. Every delayed decision, every reviewed document, every restricted access point carried meaning. Because inside the House of Windsor, power had always been exercised most effectively when it was almost invisible to the outside world. But even those carefully balanced tensions were about to shift permanently. Because according to whispers emerging from former palace staff and legal circles connected to the royal estate, the executors eventually uncovered something no faction had fully anticipated: a final directive. One allegedly buried deep within Queen Elizabeth's private instructions. And the moment it surfaced, the entire balance of the palace changed overnight. But everything changed when executors allegedly uncovered one final directive buried deep within Elizabeth's private instructions. The document itself was said to be remarkably short. No dramatic declarations. No emotional farewell. Just a precise series of instructions written with the same cold clarity that defined Queen Elizabeth's reign for more than 70 years. Yet those few pages reportedly carried enough authority to silence entire palace factions overnight. According to sources familiar with the legal review process surrounding the late Queen's private estate, the directive emerged during one of the final confidential examinations of Elizabeth's sealed personal instructions. By that stage, tensions inside the royal household had already reached an uncomfortable level. Different camps were quietly maneuvering behind the scenes. Questions surrounding access, preservation, ceremonial authority, and long-term stewardship had become increasingly sensitive. But insiders claimed the atmosphere inside the room shifted completely the moment executors reached the section concerning the private jewelry vault. Because there, written with unmistakable precision, was reportedly Elizabeth's final decision. Catherine, Princess of Wales, would become sole custodian of the collection. Not shared oversight. Not rotating administration. Sole custodianship. For a brief moment, according to palace whispers, the silence inside the meeting became almost unbearable. Because everyone present understood exactly what the wording implied. This was not merely about safeguarding necklaces, tiaras, or historic brooches. Elizabeth was allegedly making a declaration about trust, about continuity, about the future emotional identity of the monarchy itself. Reports suggest the instructions emphasized future stewardship, discipline, and preservation of institutional integrity above personal preference or political convenience. And coming from a monarch who had spent her life protecting the crown through war, scandal, divorces, constitutional crises, and public rebellion, those words carried extraordinary weight. Prince William was reportedly informed before wider family notifications began. Different interpretations suggest Elizabeth specifically intended for him to understand the significance of the decision privately before it became known elsewhere inside palace walls. Sources claim he viewed the arrangement not as a privilege for Catherine, but as a continuation of the value. His grandmother believed the monarchy would desperately need in the years ahead. Stability, restraint, silence under pressure. It was said that William immediately recognized the decision as something far larger than inheritance. This was succession psychology unfolding in real time. Princess Anne allegedly reacted with immediate support. That detail alone intensified speculation among royal observers because Anne had long been regarded as one of the monarchy's fiercest protectors of tradition. Palace insiders claim she interpreted Elizabeth's directive as both practical and symbolic. Practical because Catherine had reportedly demonstrated extraordinary caution regarding royal protocol for years. Symbolic because the decision quietly reinforced the future authority of the Wales household during a period when the institution itself appeared increasingly fragile. Sources familiar with Anne's thinking suggest she believed the monarchy could only survive future instability through disciplined continuity, not internal competition. What followed behind the scenes was swift and remarkably controlled. Palace aides were reportedly instructed to tighten inventory management procedures along with almost immediately after the directive was verified. Access permissions connected to the collection were allegedly reviewed line by line. Ceremonial authorization processes became significantly stricter. Certain historic items reportedly required direct senior approval before any future public usage could even be considered. To outside observers, nothing appeared different. But within royal operations, insiders claimed the shift was dramatic. One commentator described it as a constitutional firewall around royal heritage, a phrase that quickly spread among royal analysts attempting to interpret the deeper meaning behind Elizabeth's final move. And perhaps most revealing of all was Catherine's own reported reaction to the arrangement. Sources suggest she initially resisted public disclosure entirely. Not because she feared criticism, but because she understood how explosive the symbolism had become. The vault had transformed into something emotionally dangerous within royal life. Public confirmation risked reigniting tensions the palace was desperately trying to contain quietly behind closed doors. Catherine allegedly preferred silence, continuity, and discretion over headlines or ntion. But as speculation intensified and whispers escaped into public discussion, maintaining total secrecy became impossible. Because by then, royal commentators across Britain had already begun connecting the dots. Why Catherine had quietly gained greater symbolic authority over recent years. Why Elizabeth had reportedly trusted her so deeply. Why certain senior figures inside the monarchy suddenly appeared more guarded whenever questions about royal legacy emerged publicly. The answers were no longer buried entirely within private archives or sealed legal instructions. They were beginning to surface in fragments, one revelation at a time. And while the palace attempted to contain the revelation quietly, Catherine's eventual response would send shockwaves through royal watchers around the world. When Catherine finally addressed the growing speculation, it wasn't through outrage or triumph. There were no dramatic speeches, no carefully staged declarations. Instead, according to royal insiders, her response came with the same measured restraint that had reportedly convinced Elizabeth she could be trusted in the first place. And that restraint may have carried more power than any public defense ever could. By the time Catherine finally broke her silence, the atmosphere surrounding the palace had already become saturated with rumor, interpretation, and quiet political tension. Royal commentators had spent weeks dissecting every development connected to the late Queen's private directives. Questions about the jewelry vault had evolved into something much larger than inheritance. They had become questions about legitimacy, continuity, and the future emotional center of the monarchy itself. Yet while speculation intensified across newspapers, television panels, and royal circles, Catherine reportedly refused to rush into the storm. Sources claim she understood that every word spoken publicly would carry consequences far beyond headlines. So instead of defending herself emotionally or attempting to control the narrative aggressively, she allegedly chose something far more difficult: discipline. According to palace insiders, Catherine framed the responsibility not as a reward, but as an obligation. A duty, not a privilege. Those few words reportedly resonated deeply within royal circles because they reflected the same philosophy Queen Elizabeth herself had repeated. throughout her reign. The monarchy, in Elizabeth's view, was never supposed to revolve around personal entitlement. It revolved around stewardship, preservation, sacrifice carried quietly, often without recognition. And observers close to the institution now believe Catherine's response immediately reassured many inside the palace who feared the collection could become a source of division or public spectacle after Elizabeth's passing. What made the moment even more powerful was what Catherine did not say. She reportedly avoided discussing ownership entirely. Instead, sources claim she emphasized protection, continuity, and safeguarding the historical integrity of the collection for future generations. To royal supporters, that distinction mattered enormously. The language of possession had disappeared. In its place came the language of responsibility. And almost overnight, public reaction began shifting dramatically in her favor. Across Britain, comparisons between Catherine and the late Queen grew louder than ever before. Commentators pointed not to glamour or popularity, but to temperament, composure under pressure, emotional restraint during periods of scrutiny, a quiet instinct. CT for preserving institutional stability rather than feeding personal controversy. Some royal historians even suggested the moment echoed the younger Elizabeth during the early years of her reign, when calm endurance became her greatest weapon against uncertainty surrounding the crown. Catherine's silence before speaking had only intensified that perception. Palace commentators later admitted that the delay itself created enormous intrigue because it suggested caution instead of impulsiveness, deliberation instead of performance. Prince William reportedly viewed the entire moment as deeply significant. According to insiders familiar with conversations inside the Wales household, he allegedly believed Catherine's handling of the situation demonstrated exactly why Elizabeth trusted her so profoundly. Not because she sought authority, but because she appeared almost uncomfortable wielding it publicly. In royal life, that reluctance often signals discipline rather than weakness. And for William, observers claim, the response became one of the clearest indicators yet that Catherine was gradually evolving into the stabilizing figure the future monarchy would depend upon during increasing turbulent years ahead. Royal supporters soon began describing the entire development as the passing of the torch without ceremony. No grand declaration had been made. No public coronation of influence had occurred. Yet many believed something important had shifted permanently within the institution. Catherine was no longer being viewed solely as the future queen beside William. She was increasingly being seen as a guardian of continuity in her own right. Someone capable of carrying the emotional discipline Elizabeth had spent decades protecting inside the monarchy. And perhaps that growing perception explained why reactions within palace walls reportedly became even more complicated after Catherine's statement emerged. Because while the public largely embraced her measured response, insiders claimed the decision had already begun quietly reshaping internal relationships throughout the royal household. Certain tensions that had once remained carefully hidden behind protocol and silence were becoming harder to contain. Different factions reportedly understood that Elizabeth's final directive had altered the balance of symbolic authority inside the monarchy itself. And once that balance shifts within royal life, nothing ever truly returns to the way it was before. Because behind the composed statements, restrained language, and carefully controlled public appearances, deeper consequences were already unfolding in private. Alliances were shifting. Resentments were hardening. And within the corridors of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle alike, people were beginning to realize that the vault was never simply about jewels. It was about influence, trust, and who the monarchy itself believed should carry its future forward. But behind the public calm, the decision was already reshaping relationships inside the royal household in ways the palace could no longer conceal. Inside royal corridors, the reaction was far from unanimous. While some viewed Elizabeth's decision as an act of protection, others reportedly saw it as something far more consequential, a quiet declaration about who truly represented the future of the crown. And in a monarchy built on symbolism, that distinction changed everything. In the days following Catherine's carefully measured response, palace tensions reportedly deepened beneath the surface with remarkable speed. Publicly, the institutio Anne remained composed, disciplined, and silent. But according to insiders familiar with the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, private conversations became increasingly strained as different factions tried to understand what Elizabeth's final directive truly meant. Because once the late Queen's intentions became impossible to ignore, the issue was no longer simply about stewardship over jewels. It had evolved into a much larger question about authority, influence, and the monarchy's long-term emotional center. Reports suggest a growing divide began emerging between traditionalists and those within royal circles who favored a more modern public image for the institution. For traditionalists, Catherine's appointment represented continuity at a moment of instability. They reportedly believed Elizabeth had made a deliberate choice to reinforce discipline, hierarchy, and preservation during a period when public confidence in the monarchy had become increasingly fragile. To them, the decision was strategic, protective, necessary, but others allegedly interpreted it differently. Some insiders whispered that the move quietly consolidated symbolic authority around the royal household in ways that could reshape internal palace dynamics for decades. That perception reportedly caused particular frustration among figures connected to Queen Camilla's wider circle. While no direct public criticism ever surfaced, palace commentators claim there was growing discomfort surrounding Catherine's expanding symbolic role inside the monarchy. The issue was not formal rank. Camilla remained queen. The issue was emotional legitimacy. According to various interpretations from royal analysts, Elizabeth's final directive appeared to communicate trust on an institutional level. And within royal life, trust often carries more lasting influence than titles alone. Sources claim some palace figures quietly worried that Catherine was beginning to embody the monarchy's future identity more strongly than anyone had anticipated. At the same time, Princess Anne and Prince Edward reportedly intensified efforts to reinforce preservation structures surrounding the collection itself. Palace aides allegedly received updated guidance regarding ceremonial handling procedures, archival access, and approval systems connected to historic jewelry pieces. What once functioned as relatively routine administrative management reportedly transformed into a far more controlled process. Access surrounding major items became increasingly selective. Certain appearances required additional authorization. Even internal scheduling tied to ceremonial usage was said to undergo quiet restructuring behind closed doors. To outsiders, the monarchy still appeared united. But internally, observers claimed the institution had entered a period of silent recalibration. And through all of it, Catherine's position appeared to grow stronger not loudly, but steadily. According to royal commentators, she was increasingly being treated not merely as the future queen beside William, but as the monarchy's future institutional anchor. That distinction mattered enormously because it echoed the gradual rise of Elizabeth herself during the years before she fully settled into the role history would eventually define her by. Back then, Elizabeth's influence had not emerged through spectacle or dramatic assertion. It emerged through consistency during uncertainty, patience during crisis, quiet emotional endurance while others around her struggled to adapt. Many observers now claim Catherine's evolution on the side of the monarchy follows a remarkably similar pattern. That parallel only intensified public fascination surrounding the palace. Questions multiplied across Britain and beyond. If Elizabeth had prepared such a consequential private directive regarding the jewelry vault, what else might still remain hidden within her sealed instructions? Royal historians began revisiting old rumors connected to personal letters, confidential protocols, and undisclosed arrangements tied to succession planning. Former palace staff suddenly found themselves questioned about forgotten meetings, restricted archives, and unusual administrative decisions made during the final years of Elizabeth's reign. Every silence now seemed suspicious. Every unexplained adjustment inside royal life appeared loaded with potential meaning. And perhaps most unsettling of all was how little the palace itself attempted to deny. There were no sweeping clarifications. No aggressive pushback against speculation. Just the same controlled silence that had defined the monarchy during its most difficult moments for generations. But in this case, that silence seemed to fuel intrigue rather than suppress it. Because people increase. Ingley sensed that the jewelry vault had merely opened the door to something much larger, a carefully constructed network of final safeguards Elizabeth may have spent years quietly preparing before her death. Inside royal corridors, aides reportedly became more cautious about what they discussed and who they discussed it with. Relationships shifted subtly. Certain alliances strengthened while others cooled noticeably. And hovering over all of it was the growing realization that Queen Elizabeth's final years may have involved far more strategic preparation than the public ever understood. Because as whispers spread through Windsor and Buckingham Palace alike, one haunting question continued to linger above them all. What else did Queen Elizabeth prepare before she left the throne behind forever? To outsiders, they were jewels, objects of unimaginable value, locked behind steel and silence. But to the monarchy, they represented something far heavier. Memory, continuity, sacrifice, and survival. Every sapphire carried echoes of coronations. Every tiara reflected generations of royal crises weathered behind closed doors. And now, that burden reportedly rested in Catherine's hands alone. Our generation's royal heirlooms have existed in a strange space between history and emotion. They were never simply decorations worn for ceremonies or state banquets. According to palace historians, each piece carried invisible weight shaped by the triumphs and tragedies of the House of Windsor itself. Certain necklaces were associated with wartime resilience. Some brooches reportedly accompanied monarchs during moments of national mourning. Even the smallest pieces inside the private vault allegedly held stories connected to abdications, funerals, diplomatic crises, and fractured family relationships hidden from public view. To inherit responsibility for such a collection was not merely to preserve valuables. It was to inherit the emotional memory of the monarchy. And insiders now claim that was exactly why Queen Elizabeth trusted Catherine above everyone else. Because unlike many who became captivated by royal spectacle, Catherine reportedly understood the critical difference between glamour and institutional meaning. Palace aides who observed her during private royal preparations over the years allegedly noted her careful, almost cautious approach toward historic heirlooms. She was, as said, to ask questions about provenance, symbolism, and protocol rather than status or visibility. According to former staff members, Catherine treated the jewels less like possessions and more like fragile chapters of national history, entrusted temporarily to each generation of custodians. That distinction increasingly shaped public perception as details surrounding the vault continued emerging into wider discussion. Across Britain, people began viewing Catherine not as someone who had gained access to extraordinary privilege, but as someone burdened with extraordinary responsibility. The contrast mattered deeply. In a period when public trust in institutions often felt unstable, Catherine's restraint reportedly strengthened the image of a monarchy still capable of prioritizing duty over personal ambition. Royal supporters repeatedly emphasized the same idea. She did not appear eager to possess the collection. She appeared determined to protect it. The comparisons to Princess Diana became unavoidable. Not because Catherine resembled Diana in personality, but because both women occupied emotionally symbolic positions inside royal life during periods of intense transition. Diana had transformed the monarchy emotionally through vulnerability and connection. Elizabeth, by contrast, preserved it through discipline and endurance. Observers increasingly argued that Catherine somehow stood between those two legacies. She carried Diana's emotional accessibility while embodying Elizabeth's instinct for institutional control. And according to royal commentators, that rare balance may explain why her influence inside the monarchy has grown so steadily in recent years. At the center of that transformation stood William and Catherine together, increasingly viewed not merely as the future king and queen, but as guardians of continuity during one of the monarchy's most uncertain modern chapters. Palace insiders claim their partnership now represents something strategically vital inside royal calculations: stability, predictability, emotional discipline during a period when internal fractures and external pressures continue testing the institution from every direction. Reports suggest the couple has quietly embraced a far more protective role behind the scenes than the public fully realizes, particularly regarding preservation of royal archives, ceremonial traditions, and symbolic continuity tied to Elizabeth's reign. Those preservation efforts reportedly extend well beyond the jewelry collection itself. Sources familiar with palace operations claim stricter archival measures are now being implemented across several royal properties. Historic inventories are allegedly undergoing renewed documentation reviews. Access procedures tied to sensitive collections have reportedly become more restrictive. Certain materials connected to Elizabeth's private records are said to require enhanced authorization protocols before being handled or referenced internally. To historians inside the royal household, these developments signal something significant. They believe the transition currently unfolding was not improvised after Elizabeth's death. It was carefully engineered years in advance. And perhaps that realization changes the meaning of everything that has happened since the Vault Directive first surfaced. Because if Elizabeth spent years quietly preparing Catherine for this responsibility, then the late Queen may have understood far earlier than anyone realized just how fragile the monarchy's future could become. The jewels were never the true story. Were symbols within a much larger strategy designed to preserve continuity during a dangerous period of uncertainty. And according to whispers still circulating inside royal corridors, Elizabeth's final preparations may not even be fully revealed yet. Because in the end, the private vault represented only one piece of a far greater vision. The late Queen allegedly spent her final years protecting in silence. But the final chapter of Elizabeth's decision was never truly about jewels. It was about the future she believed the monarchy would need to survive what was coming next. In the end, Queen Elizabeth's final act may not have been political at all. It may have been personal. A quiet calculation made after decades of watching alliances shift, scandals erupt, and the institution she devoted her life to struggle against a rapidly changing world. Because when the time came to protect the private treasures of the crown, she reportedly entrusted them not to the loudest voice, but to the steadiest pair of hands. For those who spent years studying Queen Elizabeth's reign, the decision now feels less like a sudden surprise, and more like the final piece of a strategy she had been quietly shaping. Long before the public realized it existed. Throughout her 70 years on the throne, Elizabeth witnessed moments that nearly shattered the monarchy from within. Abdications, public betrayals, family divisions, global scrutiny unlike anything previous monarchs had ever faced. Yet through every crisis, one principle reportedly guided her above all others. The survival of the institution had to come before personal emotion. And according to palace insiders, that philosophy ultimately shaped every detail of her final directives surrounding the private vault. What Catherine inherited was never simply custodianship over jewels. She inherited responsibility for protecting a symbol of continuity that stretched across generations of royal history. Sources close to former palace staff claim Elizabeth believed Catherine understood something many people around the monarchy often failed to grasp: that royal symbolism only survives when it is treated with discipline instead of entitlement. That belief, insiders say, became central to the late Queen's trust in her. Catherine's stewardship now appears framed not as a personal elevation, but as the continuation of values Elizabeth spent a lifetime. I'm defending quietly behind palace walls. At the center of that transition stands William beside her, and together they are increasingly viewed as the monarchy's long-term stabilizing force during a period of enormous uncertainty. According to various interpretations from royal commentators, the Wales household has gradually become the emotional anchor around which the institution is attempting to rebuild public confidence. Not through spectacle, not through dramatic declarations, but through consistency, restraint, and carefully maintained unity during moments when public faith in royal life often appears dangerously fragile. Palace insiders claim the executors themselves privately viewed Elizabeth's final arrangements as an effort to future-proof the monarchy, ensuring that the institution's emotional core remained protected even as the world surrounding it changed rapidly. And perhaps that explains why public reaction shifted so strongly in Catherine's favor once the full significance of the decision became clearer. The more details emerged, the more many people began interpreting the move not as favoritism, but as trust earned slowly over years of discipline and quiet loyalty. Why reports suggest confidence in the Wales household strengthened considerably as royal watchers compared Catherine's measured conduct to the turbulence that has often surrounded other figures within the monarchy. Once again, the contrast between duty and ambition became impossible to ignore. While others allegedly fought for influence through visibility, Catherine's influence appeared to grow strongest through silence. That silence, in many ways, became the most powerful statement of all. She never publicly celebrated the decision, never transformed it into a personal victory, never attempted to dominate the headlines surrounding it. According to royal commentators, that restraint may have reinforced Elizabeth's judgment more effectively than any formal explanation ever could. Because within the monarchy, composure under pressure has always carried its own form of authority. And Catherine's refusal to weaponize the moment reportedly convinced even some skeptics that Elizabeth's final calculation may have been far more deliberate than anyone initially understood. Now, as historians and royal insiders continue examining the implications of the late Queen's private instructions, Jewelry Vault itself has become something almost symbolic of Elizabeth's final legacy. Not because of the diamonds or sapphires hidden behind secured doors, but because of what those treasures represented to the monarchy she spent her life protecting. Continuity during instability, duty during temptation, endurance through chaos. In many ways, the vault became a reflection of the crown itself, beautiful from the outside, but held together internally by discipline, sacrifice, and generations of silent responsibility. And perhaps that is the deeper truth lingering behind every revelation that has surfaced since Elizabeth's passing. The late Queen reportedly understood that the future of the monarchy would not be decided by glamour, headlines, or popularity alone. It would be decided by whether those entrusted with its legacy possessed the emotional discipline to protect it when the institution became vulnerable. That was the lesson hidden beneath the secrecy, the silence, and the carefully guarded directives now emerging piece by piece from behind palace walls. Because within the House of Windsor, power was never measured by who wore the jewels, but by who could be trusted to protect the hat they truly represented. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.